In today's video, you're going to learn everything you need to know regarding the useReducer hook within React. First, we're going to go over just an overview of useReducer. Then we're going to talk about what exactly is a reducer anyways. And then we'll kind of get into the specifics of how useReducer works, as well as an example of where you might use this within your applications. So for the useReducer hook, it is an alternative to useState. So it's a hook within React that allows you to manage state. And it is preferable to use state when you have a bit more complex state. So say you have several similar state values that you need to manage within a component, you might decide to use useReducer rather than creating like 7 different calls to use state. Additionally, it's also a bit more easy to use useReducer when your state values typically rely on your previous state. So if you're constantly setting a new state based on previous state, it can be more helpful to just use the useReducer hook rather than use state. Now, to kind of get into this hook a little bit more, I think it's important to understand kind of overall, just like conceptually, what is a reducer? Well, a reducer is a function that takes multiple things and outputs just one thing. So if you think about JavaScript, you can use the .reduce method on an array. And this method will take the collection of elements within that array and it will output one single thing. And that's fairly similar to how the useReducer hook works. You can take the previous state as well as some data passed into your reducer function, and then you output just one single state value. So you'll take multiple things and just output one single thing with your reducer hook. And that one single thing will be a new state value for your component in which you're calling that useReducer hook within. So how does the useReducer hook actually work? Well, the useReducer hook takes 2 required arguments. The first of which is going to be a reducer function. And the second argument is going to be the initial state of that component. And your useReducer hook is going to return an array of 2 elements, similar to how the useState hook returns an array of 2 elements. But the useReducer hook, the 2 elements, the first element is going to be your state. And the second element is actually going to be a function to update your state. This is typically called a dispatch function. And I will go over all of this in more detail here. This is more so an overview of how this works, and then we'll go into examples of how this works to make things more clear. But your reducer function that you pass in to useReducer as the first argument, that is going to be a function that takes 2 arguments. The first argument is going to be your previous state. So when you use your dispatch function to update your state, since you use that function, React is automatically going to call your reducer function with the previous state as the first argument. So you're going to write a reducer function and the first argument is going to be the previous state of your component. And the second argument is going to be an action. And this action is going to be an object containing some data to help you update your state. So in kind of this reducer pattern, typically you dispatch an object to update your state, and this object is called an action. And this action has a type property, and that type property will let the reducer know what kind of action is occurring and allow you to update your state accordingly. Now, inside this action, you might also have a payload property with some new data to update your state as well. But I will show you an example of this, and it will come together to make more sense, but just know that the useReducer hook, it is a little bit tricky. And the first time I learned about it, I didn't understand it at all. Like, I watched a video tutorial about it and I literally thought to myself, I have zero idea of what just went down in this video. So if you're feeling like that and you're not just like a programming prodigy that knows everything the first time you hear it, then I'm with you. It is okay. You will understand it. I would just recommend like doing your own test applications and really playing around with this on yourself. That's what really helped me learn this as well. But a reducer function will take 2 arguments. The first is going to be the previous state of your component. React will automatically pass that previous state in to your reducer function as the first argument. when you update your state with your dispatch function that is returned from your useReducer call. And the second argument is going to be an action that's going to have a type property to let the reducer know how you should update your state. And then that action might also have a payload property with some new data to also allow you to update your state with that new data. But let's get into an example of how this actually looks in some kind of live code here and what's going on. Now, this is going to be a lot to take in. Like I said earlier, I would recommend going over this multiple times, but the biggest thing is playing around with this yourself and really getting the hang of this. All right, because I do think that it's very likely you'll see this within your React code. And if you use anything like Redux, which is a state management library for React, you're going to see this pattern. And this pattern, I think in general, is helpful to know. It just takes a second to wrap your head around it. At least it did for me. So let's go down to my component here first. And what I have going on here is I have a form component. And what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to have just a basic form, and then I'm going to manage my state with useReducer for the state of my form. Now, I'm not saying this is how you should manage state within forms. There's other libraries to help you take care of that. But if you think of a form, you have several inputs within a form that is all kind of a related state. They're all inputs of that form, right? So it's all related in some way. However, for each input, you're likely going to be updating your state on your onChange event. So you're going to be updating your state a lot based on previous state. So adding a character and different things like that. And you're going to want to manage your entire form state together, most likely. So I think this is a good example to where you'll have several pieces of state and managing that within the useReducer hook, because it's a little bit more complex and you have several pieces of related state here. And you'll be updating state a lot on previous state. So I think this is a good kind of example for that. So I just have a basic form component here. And what I have is I just have a kind of a wrapper main tag. And then within that, I have my form tag. Then I just have some labels with some different inputs. So we have a first name input, a last name input, and then an email input. So 3 separate inputs. And then if we look at a web browser here, you're going to see I have a very nicely styled web page here with my 3 inputs. So what I do here up at the top of my component is I call my useReducer hook. And when calling this useReducer hook, I first import it at the top of my file, import useReducer from React. But here I call it with my 2 arguments. The first is my reducer function. So let's go check out my reducer function. As I said in kind of my overview, this reducer function right here is just a plain JavaScript function. I know it can seem scary, but it's just a JavaScript function. And in this reducer function, React is automatically going to pass the previous state of my component as my first argument. So you can see when I set up my function, the first argument I have here is my previous state. And as I also mentioned in my overview, the second argument to your reducer function is going to be some action. And this is going to be an object that is going to have a type property that kind of lets you know how you should update your state. So within this reducer function, I have a few different if statements, and then I return some new state based on those if statements. So I access the action.type property here, and I check, okay, is that action.type property, is it equal to a certain action? And if true, then I'm going to return some new state here. And whatever you return from your reducer function, that's going to be your new state of your application. And a good convention to follow is to have some constant of all of the different actions that you expect within your reducer. So here I have a constant called action types, and I have 3 different actions or 3 different action types that I expect. One is on first name change. So this is how I'm going to handle when a user changes their first name within their inputs. On last name change, how I'll handle when the user changes their last name. And then on email change, how I'm going to handle when the user changes their email. And within my reducer function, I handle all 3 of these cases. I check, okay, is my action type equal to on first name change? or is it equal to on last name change? And then I handle my state updates accordingly. Now, if none of these action types come true, it means that I'm calling my reducer function with some action type that I'm not handling. And that is almost always an error, and I like to throw an error here. You could also maybe return just your previous state, although when something happens in my program, I like to know about it. The most tricky bugs to solve for me anyways are the ones in which I have no error message. So here I like to throw a new error. Now, it's also very common within a reducer function to see a switch statement here. Personally, I kind of like if statements a little bit better. I find this very readable here with just doing if and then doing an early return here if this logic is true. I find this structure a little bit more readable than a switch statement, but you might also see someone writing a switch statement in which they put the action.type within their switch condition and then kind of handle those different cases accordingly. All right. But what I'm going to do here in my reducer function is, okay, if the action type is on first name change, then I'm going to spread my previous state into this new state object that I'm returning. So the reason that you need to do this is because if I didn't spread my previous state within this object, I would lose all of the state for my different inputs within my application. So here, if I only set my first name value here, then I would lose my last name value and my email value and different things like that if I didn't make sure to spread my previous state. So in your reducer functions, you're probably going to have to make sure that you maintain your previous state when you're returning your new state. Because if I didn't do this and I just returned my first name is equal to this new value here, then it's only going to have my first name value within my inputs and it's going to get rid of my other values, which is probably not what you want. So here, since my action type is on first name change, then when I call my reducer function, I'm also going to set my payload property to the new first name value that the user types in. So that is going to be my payload property of my action. I'll show you how I call this in just a second. But then I'm going to set my first name property within my state to my action.payload, my new first name value. And I'm doing that for really any of these. But the only difference is that, so on last name change, I'm spreading the previous state and I'm updating my last name value to my action.payload, my new value that the user types in. And then for email, I'm spreading the previous state and I'm updating my email to my new value, my action.payload. All right. Now, the second argument I pass to useReducer is my initial state. So my initial state here, I am just initializing this to an object that has first name, last name, and email. All of those are just set to empty strings. So this will initialize my state to this object with these three properties all as empty strings. And what it returns here is my state. So I'm just calling this my form state. And then it also returns a dispatch value. And I am automatically just destructuring these from my useState hook. But keep in mind what's going on here is that useReducer is returning an array of these two elements. And I'm just destructuring these elements right away from that array. But I could just, set a constant to some array and then say array at index 0 is my form state, array at index 1 is my dispatch value. And then within the body of my form component, I'm going to console log my form state. Now, in my return statement here, in my input values, this is where the main logic is going to occur as it relates to the useReducer hook here. So first off, I'm going to set my values of my inputs to my state. So I'm going to make these controlled inputs here, in which I'm going to control the state within my useReducer hook. So I'm setting my first name input. The value of that is going to be my form state dot first name. And then same thing for my last name input. The value is going to be my form state last name, and same thing for my email input here. Now, when a change event occurs, so I'm handling this on change event, I'm going to call this function that I pass in here. So I'm just using an inline anonymous function that I pass into my on change event. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to call my dispatch function to update my state. So I'm going to call this dispatch function here. And what do I need to dispatch? Well, I need to dispatch an action. And this action is going to be an object that has a type property to tell my reducer here what type of action that it needs to handle. And then it's also, in this case, not every action that you'll use within your components will have a payload. But in this case, I need to also tell my reducer what new value the user is typing in here. So when this onChange event occurs and the user's typing in their first name, I need to know what values they're typing in. And what are those values going to be? Well, that is going to be accessible on my event object here, and it's going to be accessed on the target.value property. So here I'm calling my dispatch function and I'm passing in an object with a type of onFirstNameChange and a payload of my event.target.value, which will be the new value the user types in. And it's the same way for all my other inputs. On the onChange, I dispatch an action with a type property here called onLastNameChange, since this is my last name input, with my new payload. And what this is going to do when I call this dispatch function, it's going to call my reducer function here. It's going to automatically pass in the previous state of my component, and then my action, that object that I dispatched, is then going to be passed in as an argument to my second parameter here of my reducer function, which will allow me to return some new state here, because whatever I return from my reducer will be the new state of my component. All right. Now, let me go back to my browser, type into my inputs, and then we'll console log my current state of my application so you can kind of see this at work. So here, if I come back here and I open up my inspector, you're going to see that if I just refresh my page here, I see my form state. It's just going to be what I initialized my state to. So I'm going to have first name, last name, and email all set to an empty string. But here, when I type in to my first name input here, you see that right away when I type my first letter, that's going to trigger an onChange event for this first name input. And what that's going to do is as soon as I start typing into this first name input, it's going to trigger this onChange event, and it's going to call this function here. And within this function, I'm going to dispatch an action or dispatch an object with a type and payload property. The payload is going to be whatever kind of new characters that I type into my input. And the type here is going to be onFirstNameChange. So this dispatch function, when I call this function, it's going to call my reducer here. It's going to pass in the previous state of my application automatically. And then it's going to assign that object that I'm dispatching here. It's going to assign this object to my second parameter of this reducer function. And since my action that I'm dispatching has the type of onFirstNameChange, we're going to enter this if condition, and I'm going to return all of my previous state, and then I'm going to update my first name property to my action.payload, or whatever characters that the user is typing in. And then when I update that state, it's going to set this value here is going to be equivalent to that new state that I returned from my reducer function, because I've made this a controlled component. So if I go back to my browser here and finish this out, you can see first name gets updated to Ryan here. And then I just realized that I have a mistake here. This should actually be last name for my input label. But going back here, if I update my last name here, you see that my first name is now Ryan, my last name is now Solomon, and this is my new updated state. But if I forgot to update my previous state within my reducer function and forgot to maintain my previous state, so I'll actually do this here. When I update my email here, I'm going to forget to pass in my previous state. And when I do this here, you're going to see that once I start typing a new email, it's going to update my email value, but I'm going to actually lose my previous state from my other values. So if I start typing in my new values here, you're going to see that my current state, it only includes my email property. Now, it didn't necessarily make my values here disappear in these other inputs because I then have switched this from a controlled to uncontrolled input, in which my browser, it still knows the values of these components, but I'm not managing them anymore within React because my state here only has my email property because I forgot to maintain my state in my reducer function by passing in my previous state. And then you can see this error that I'm getting here. A component is changing from controlled input to uncontrolled because I'm no longer managing these values within my state because I'm forgetting to spread my previous state here when I'm updating my email. So that is how the useReducer hook works within React. It is definitely a little bit tricky, but go over this a couple times. Honestly, this probably isn't best for my own YouTube growth, but watching like different people explain this also helped me. Just getting different perspectives on different teaching styles and stuff like that can help. But the number one thing is actually just playing around with this on your own and trying to figure out how this works and just running through these examples on your own and playing around with it yourself. I think that is going to help the most. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of how the useReducer hook works and kind of where you would use this instead of use state. And I will see you in that next one.